In the early hours of September 17, 1939, as the first rays of dawn pierced the misty forests along Poland's eastern frontier, the unthinkable unfolded. Soviet tanks and infantry columns surged across the border, shattering the fragile peace that had held since the Treaty of Riga in 1921. This was no mere border skirmish, it was a full-scale invasion, coordinated in secret with Nazi Germany under the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed just weeks earlier. Poland, already reeling from the German onslaught that began on September 1st, now faced enemies on two fronts. Caught in the crossfire were the dedicated men of the Korpus Ochrony Pogranicza, or Border Protection Corps, known as KOP. These border detachments, tasked with guarding over 1,400 kilometers of rugged terrain from the Baltic to the Carpathians, suddenly found themselves isolated amid the chaos of a collapsing nation. Their story is one of vanishing units, lost communications, and uncertain fates, emblematic of the broader tragedy that engulfed Poland in those fateful weeks. The KOP detachments became lost in the truest sense during this September campaign, a term that encapsulates Poland's desperate defense against overwhelming odds. As German forces blitzed through the west, claiming cities like Warsaw and Krakow with mechanized precision, the eastern border guards were left undermanned and under-equipped. Many battalions had been redeployed westward earlier in the summer, leaving skeletal forces to patrol vast stretches of woodland, marsh, and riverine borders. When the Soviets struck without warning, these detachments, comprising infantry, cavalry, and light artillery, were ordered not to resist initially, a directive from Polish high command that aimed to avoid provoking a second war. But confusion reigned as radio messages crackled with conflicting instructions, and soon, isolated outposts were overrun. Units like the Polsy Brigade and Sarny Regiment vanished into the fog of war, their last positions marked only by abandoned watchtowers and scattered equipment. Historians later pieced together from after-action reports and survivor testimonies that thousands of these soldiers were either killed in hasty engagements, captured and marched into Soviet captivity, or dispersed into guerrilla bands that melted into the countryside. To understand why these border detachments are remembered as missing or lost, one must delve into the immediate aftermath of the invasion. The Soviet advance was swift and merciless, with Red Army divisions pushing deep into Polish territory, aiming to link up with German forces and partition the country as per their secret agreement. KOP units, trained primarily for border security rather than full-scale warfare, lacked the heavy weaponry to counter tanks and aircraft. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe frantic retreats through dense forests near rivers like the Bug and Pripyat, where small detachments held defensive lines for hours before being encircled. For instance, in the region around Kal and Sarny, groups of several hundred men each fought rearguard actions, delaying Soviet motorized columns but at tremendous cost. Battlefield recovery records from post-war exhumations reveal mass graves where entire platoons were buried hastily, their identities lost to the elements in the haste of combat. The uncertainty surrounding their fates was compounded by the Soviet policy of denying prisoner of war status to many captured Poles, leading to executions and deportations that obscured the true toll. This disappearance was not just physical but also archival. In the whirlwind of the campaign, unit journals and diaries were often destroyed or captured, leaving gaps in the historical record. Polish military archives, many of which were evacuated or burned during the retreats, offer only fragmented insights. For example, the last known transmission from a KOP battalion near Dog-Grodek reported heavy artillery fire before going silent, a poignant echo of the broader silence that fell over these units. Historians analyzing these events note that the lost status stems from the dual invasion speed, which prevented organized withdrawals and led to ad hoc groupings. One such group, under the command of General Wilhelm Orlik-Rückemann, exemplified this resilience and tragedy. Gathering remnants from shattered detachments, he formed a mobile force that pressed on despite dwindling supplies, embodying the spirit of defiance amid inevitable defeat. The human element deepens the narrative of these lost detachments. These were not elite troops but everyday Poles, farmers from the eastern Kresy, teachers turned soldiers, and veterans of earlier conflicts, who had spent years patrolling remote borders against smugglers and spies. Their diaries, preserved in some cases by survivors who escaped to the west, speak of loyalty to a homeland under siege. One account from a KOP sergeant describes watching Soviet planes overhead while his unit dug in near the Sluch River, knowing reinforcement was impossible. As the campaign progressed, these detachments became symbols of Poland's betrayed sovereignty, their vanishing acts a metaphor for the nation's erasure from the map by its aggressors. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact secret protocols had doomed them from the start, allocating eastern Poland to Soviet control without regard for the defenders on the ground. Expanding on this opening moment, the invasion's scale was staggering. Over 600,000 Soviet troops crossed the border that day, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, against a Polish eastern defense that numbered fewer than 25,000 in COP ranks after redeployments. The border outposts, often manned by just a dozen men each, were the first to fall. Reports from the time detail how Soviet border guards, feigning routine patrols, suddenly turned aggressive, overwhelming watchtowers with superior numbers. In places like the Polsy marshes, detachments held out longer due to the terrain's natural barriers, but even there, isolation led to surrender or annihilation. The term lost unit thus encompasses not only those wiped out but also those fragmented into smaller bands that attempted to link up with retreating Polish armies, only to be intercepted or disbanded. The strategic implications of these lost detachments rippled through the entire September campaign. By tying down Soviet forces in sporadic fights, they inadvertently bought time for some Polish civilians and officials to evacuate southward toward Romania and Hungary. Yet, the cost was immense. Estimates from military archives suggest up to 3,000 COP soldiers killed in the east alone, with thousands more captured and later subjected to the horrors of Soviet gulags or the Cotton massacres. Conflicting documents from Soviet sources, declassified after the Cold War, underreport these engagements to minimize embarrassments, further muddying the historical waters. Polish exile accounts, compiled in London during the war, provide counter-narratives of heroism, such as ambushes that destroyed Soviet supply convoys. In framing this as a lost chapter, it's essential to note the broader context of World War II's onset. Poland's defense, though ultimately futile, delayed the Axis powers and exposed the fragility of European alliances. The COP's fate highlights the betrayal by supposed neutrals, as the Soviets justified their invasion as protection for ethnic minorities, a pretext belied by the subsequent occupations and purges. Today, these events remind us of the vulnerabilities of borders and the human stories behind military statistics. As we reconstruct this history from wartime diaries and analyst reports, the lost detachments emerge not as footnotes but as central figures in Poland's tragic stand. The drama of that September morning set the stage for a campaign marked by asymmetry and sacrifice. As Soviet forces advanced, COP commanders like Orlik-Rückemann rallied what remained, forging a path through adversity that would lead to notable clashes. Their story, pieced together from fragmented records, underscores why these units are considered irretrievably lost, swallowed by the tides of invasion, their final actions a testament to endurance in the face of oblivion. But events were about to shift rapidly, as the remnants coalesced into a fighting force amid the encroaching darkness. The Korpus Ochrony Pogranicza, or Border Protection Corps, commonly abbreviated as COP, was established on September 17, 1924, in the aftermath of Poland's hard-won independence in the Polish-Soviet War that concluded with the Treaty of Riga in 1921. This treaty had redrawn the eastern borders, leaving Poland with a vast and volatile frontier stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south, encompassing diverse terrains like dense forests, marshlands, and open plains. The Polish government, under the leadership of Marshal Józef Pilsudski, recognized the need for a specialized force to secure this boundary against ongoing threats from the Soviet Union, including cross-border raids, espionage, and smuggling operations that undermined the young republic's stability. General Henryk Mankiewicz-Odrawas was appointed as the first commander, tasked with organizing a corps that blended military discipline with frontier policing duties. Drawing from existing army units and volunteers, the COP began as a modest outfit but quickly grew into a formidable entity, reflecting Poland's determination to safeguard its sovereignty in a region marked by ethnic tensions and geopolitical rivalries. By the mid-1920s, the COP structure had solidified into 6 brigades and 5 independent regiments, each named after key regions such as Polsy, Sarny, Wilno, Nowogródek, Głęboki, and Podol. These formations were strategically deployed along the 1,412-kilometer eastern border, with headquarters in places like Luk and Sarny to facilitate rapid response. The Corps expanded over the years, reaching a peak strength of approximately 25,000 personnel by 1939, including 32 infantry battalions, 21 cavalry squadrons, and specialized mountain detachments adapted to the Carpathian foothills. Command rotated among experienced officers, but by the late 1930s, General Wilhelm Orlik-Rückemann assumed overall leadership, bringing his expertise from earlier border skirmishes and his service in the Polish legions during World War I. Orlik-Rückemann, a seasoned tactician known for his emphasis on mobility and reconnaissance, oversaw the Corps during its most critical period, coordinating with the Polish General Staff to integrate COP into national defense plans. His deputies, including colonels like Józef Kustrin and Adam Epler, managed specific brigades, ensuring a chain of command that balanced autonomy for border operations with centralized oversight. The primary mission of the COP was multifaceted, extending beyond mere defense to encompass intelligence gathering, anti-subversion activities, and even civilian support in remote areas. In its early years, the Corps conducted over 5,000 arrests of spies and smugglers, engaged in 89 armed clashes, and dismantled numerous bandit groups, as detailed in official military archives preserved in Warsaw. Units patrolled on foot, horseback, and occasionally with armored cars, monitoring for Soviet incursions that tested the Riga Treaty's boundaries. Beyond security, COP soldiers built infrastructure like roads and bridges, provided medical aid to local populations, and assisted in agricultural development, fostering loyalty among the ethnically diverse inhabitants of the Eastern Crusade, Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews, who often viewed the Corps as a stabilizing force. This community engagement was crucial in countering Soviet propaganda that sought to exploit ethnic grievances, and unit journals from the period highlight initiatives like literacy programs and veterinary services that endeared the COP to civilians while gathering valuable human intelligence. Training for COP personnel was rigorous and tailored to the unique demands of border warfare, emphasizing endurance, marksmanship, and small unit tactics over large-scale maneuvers. Recruits, often drawn from rural backgrounds with familiarity in harsh environments, underwent months of instruction at bases like Oswiecim and Sarny, where they learned ambush techniques, night patrols, and the use of natural cover in forested or swampy terrains. Equipment included standard Polish Army rifles like the Mauser WZ-98, machine guns such as the Browning WZ-28, and light artillery pieces including Bofors 37mm anti-tank guns and 75mm field howitzers. Cavalry squadrons trained in reconnaissance and rapid flanking, while mountain battalions in the south practiced alpine warfare with skis and pack animals. By the 1930s, the COP incorporated limited mechanization, adding armored cars and motorcycles, though shortages in heavy weaponry persisted due to budget constraints. Historian analyses, such as those from the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, underscore how this training regime prepared the Corps for guerrilla-style engagements rather than conventional battles, a foresight that proved vital in 1939. The operational environment for the COP was one of constant vigilance amid escalating international tensions. The eastern border, riddled with rivers like the Dnieper and Bug, and vast wetlands such as the Pripyat marshes, posed logistical challenges, poor roads hindered supply lines, and harsh winters tested troop morale. Soviet activities intensified in the 1930s, with documented provocations including kidnappings and artillery exchanges, as revealed in declassified Polish diplomatic reports. The Corps operated under the umbrella of Poland's broader military strategy, which by 1939 focused on defending against potential German aggression in the west while maintaining a lighter presence in the east. However, the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 23, 1939, secretly divided Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, unbeknownst to Polish planners. As mobilization began on August 30, many COP battalions were transferred westward to bolster armies like the Łódź and Pommer's groups, leaving only about 25 battalions, roughly 12,000 men, in the east, stripped of much artillery and anti-tank support. This redeployment occurred within the larger framework of the September Campaign, Poland's defensive war against the German invasion that commenced on September 1, 1939. The campaign involved mobilizing over 1 million Polish troops across multiple fronts, with strategies centered on delaying actions to allow French and British allies to intervene, a hope dashed by the lack of Western support. COP units in the west, such as the mountain battalions at Wieżierska Górka, fought valiantly in early battles, holding mountain passes against German panzers and inflicting significant delays. In the east, the remaining detachments monitored the Soviet border under strict orders to avoid provocation, even as intelligence reports warned of Red Army buildups. The operational doctrine, outlined in Plan East, envisioned COP as a screening force to detect invasions, but the dual threats overwhelmed this setup. Eyewitness accounts from COP officers described the anxiety of those final days in August, with patrols noting unusual Soviet troop movements across the border. As summer turned to autumn, the COP's role evolved from static defense to mobile resistance, adapting to the fluid chaos of invasion. Commanders like Orlik-Rückemann emphasized flexibility, using the terrain's natural defenses, dense woods for ambushes and rivers as barriers, to compensate for numerical inferiority. The Corps integration into the September Campaign highlighted Poland's strategic dilemmas: overextended supply lines, outdated equipment compared to German and Soviet forces, and the absence of air support left units vulnerable. Military archives detail how COP logistics relied on horse-drawn wagons and local foraging, a far cry from the mechanized armies arrayed against them. Yet, the men's esprit de corps, forged through years of border service, sustained them. Many were veterans of the 1919 to 1921 war, bringing personal grudges against Soviet forces that fueled their determination. The broader campaign's context cannot be overstated. Germany's blitzkrieg tactics, employing over 1.5 million troops, 2,000 tanks, and 1,900 aircraft, shattered Polish lines in the west, while the Soviets prepared a similar onslaught in the east with 600,000 men in vast armored reserves. Polish High Command, led by Marshal Edward Ryd-Smigly, issued directives for eastward units to retreat westward if attacked, aiming to consolidate forces near the Romanian bridgehead. For the KOP, this meant abandoning fixed positions and navigating through civilian exodus routes clogged with refugees. Historian interpretations emphasize how the pact secrecy caught Poland off guard, turning the eastern border from a watchful frontier into a trap. The KOP's pre-war exercises, simulating incursions, proved inadequate against the scale of what was to come, yet they instilled a resilience that would manifest in the coming weeks. In accessible terms for those reflecting on this era, the KOP represented the everyday guardians of Poland's independence, men who lived among the people they protected, far from the glamour of parade grounds. Their formation and operations were a direct response to the interwar period's instabilities, where borders were not mere lines on maps but lifelines of national survival. As the storm clouds gathered in 1939, these detachments stood as the first line against betrayal, their story intertwined with the tragic unfolding of World War II's opening act. Yet the final hours of preparation gave way to action, as the invasions converged and tested the core metal in ways unimaginable. But events were about to shift rapidly, with the Soviet incursion transforming vigilance into desperate survival. As tensions mounted across Europe in the summer of 1939, the Korpus Ochrony Pogranicza found itself on high alert. On August 30, 1939, mobilization orders were issued for the KOP under General Wilhelm Orlik-Rückemann, who had assumed command earlier that month on August 8. This directive came amid growing intelligence reports of German troop concentrations along the western border and unusual Soviet movements in the east. The KOP units, scattered across a 300-kilometer stretch from Klek in the north to Dog-Grodek, Rokitno, and Brzeszczyk in the south, began assembling their forces. Brigades such as Polsy, Sarny, and Wielno mobilized their infantry battalions, cavalry squadrons, and light artillery pieces, drawing from depots in Luk and Sarny. Terrain in this region was challenging, dense forests interspersed with marshes along the Pripyat River and Bug River valleys, complicating logistics. Supplies were hastily gathered, rifles, ammunition, and limited anti-tank guns like the Bofors 37mm, transported via horse-drawn wagons over rudimentary roads. Radio communications were established with Polish High Command in Warsaw, but signals were intermittent due to the remote locations. Unit journals from this period record a sense of urgency, with commanders like Colonel Józef Kustrin noting the redeployment of several battalions westward, leaving the eastern frontier undermanned at about 12,000 men. By the evening of August 31st, patrols intensified along the border outposts. Eyewitness accounts from KOP sentries described spotting Soviet border guards increasing their presence across the line, though no overt hostilities occurred. The operational environment was one of watchful waiting, with logistics focused on stockpiling food and medical supplies for potential prolonged engagements. Historian analyses, based on post-war Polish archives, highlight how this mobilization stripped the KOP of heavier equipment, as priorities shifted to counter the anticipated German threat. On the morning of September 1st, the German invasion erupted with overwhelming force. Luftwaffe bombers struck Polish airfields, and Wehrmacht panzer divisions crossed the border in the west. For the KOP, this meant immediate action for those units already transferred westward. Mountain battalions like those from Skol and Delitin, part of the Carpathian Brigade, were thrust into defensive battles near Wieżierska Górka. There, on September 1st and 2nd, they held strategic mountain passes against advancing German infantry and tanks. After action reports detail intense artillery exchanges, with Polish 75mm guns inflicting delays on the enemy, but at the cost of heavy casualties, over 100 killed in the first day alone. Terrain favored the defenders initially, with steep slopes channeling German advances into kill zones, but superior German air support eventually overwhelmed them. As the German blitzkrieg progressed, KOP detachments in the east remained vigilant but uninvolved in the initial fighting. Communications with Western units became sporadic, with radio logs showing desperate requests for reinforcements that went unheeded. By September 3, some Eastern KOP battalions received orders to dispatch reinforcements westward, further depleting their strength. For instance, elements of the Wielno Brigade were rerouted to the Łódź Army, marching through contested areas under threat of air raids. Battlefield recovery records from later investigations reveal abandoned equipment along these routes, including machine guns and supply carts destroyed by Stuka dive bombers. In the operational theater, the Korps' role shifted subtly. Patrols continued monitoring the Soviet border, reporting no unusual activity initially, but tension built as news of Polish defeats in the west filtered through. Unit diaries from Sarny Regiment describe morale dipping as soldiers learned of the fall of border towns like Gdynia. Logistics strained under the dual burden of maintaining eastern vigilance while supporting western redeployments, with supply lines stretched thin over poor infrastructure. The situation escalated dramatically on the morning of September 17. At approximately 4 a.m., Soviet forces crossed the eastern border in force, with Red Army divisions advancing under the pretext of protecting ethnic minorities. The KOP, caught off guard despite prior suspicions, received urgent orders from Marshal Edward Reid-Smygley not to engage the Soviets aggressively but to retreat westward if possible. This directive, transmitted via radio, led to immediate confusion. Isolated outposts, such as those near Dog-Grodek, faced overwhelming Soviet infantry and tanks. Eyewitness testimonies from survivors recount brief skirmishes where small KOP detachments, armed only with rifles and light machine guns, held off initial probes before withdrawing. For example, the Klek Battalion engaged Soviet scouts near the Sluch River, inflicting minor casualties before falling back under artillery fire. Terrain played a key role here. The dense Posi forest provided cover for retreats, but marshes slowed movements, leaving units vulnerable to encirclement. Communications broke down rapidly. Radio logs show frantic messages reporting Soviet advances, with responses from high command delayed or absent due to the ongoing chaos in Warsaw. In the hours following the invasion, General Orlik-Rückemann took decisive action. By midday on September 17, he began consolidating remnants of scattered KOP units around Kau, a key rail junction in Volhynia. Drawing from the Posi Brigade, Sarny Regiment, and Klek Battalion, he amassed approximately 9,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, and a few artillery pieces. After-action reports indicate this group included about 32 infantry companies, 21 cavalry troops, and limited anti-tank support. The operational environment was dire, supplies were low, with ammunition rationed and food foraged from local villages. Movements were coordinated via couriers when radios failed, navigating through forested paths to avoid Soviet patrols. Historian analyzes emphasize Orlik-Rückemann's strategy of mobility, using the terrain's natural barriers like the Pripyat marshes to evade detection. By dusk on September 18, the group had established a loose perimeter near Kau, with reconnaissance patrols scouting southward routes. Mid-September marked a period of intense maneuvering. On September 19, Orlik-Rückemann ordered the group to march southward toward Warsaw, aiming to link up with the independent operational group Posi under General Franciszek Kleeberg. The column, divided into northern and southern elements for better concealment, advanced through dense woodlands near Kamień and Kosierski. Communications with other Polish forces were minimal, relying on intermittent radio contacts that revealed defeats at Brzeszcz and Kobrin, forcing a route adjustment. Logistics were improvised, wagons carried the wounded, while cavalry screened the flanks. Eyewitness accounts describe constant harassment from Soviet reconnaissance aircraft, buzzing overhead and directing artillery strikes. By the evening of September 20, the group had covered 50 kilometers, but desertions began as morale waned amid rumors of Poland's capitulation. From September 21 to 22, the march continued amid escalating skirmishes. Near the village of Mielniki, a KOP cavalry squadron ambushed a Soviet patrol, capturing documents that revealed Red Army intentions to encircle Polish remnants east of the Bug River. Terrain shifted to more open plains interspersed with rivers, complicating crossings under fire. Radio logs from this period show appeals for air support that never materialized, as the Polish Air Force was decimated. The group's strength held at around 8,000, but exhaustion set in after days of forced marches with minimal rest. Historian interpretations, drawing from survivor diaries, note how Orlik-Rückemann maintained discipline through personal leadership, addressing troops at halts to reinforce their mission. September 23 brought further challenges as the group pressed on through forests toward Sak. On that morning, scouts reported Soviet infantry concentrations ahead, prompting defensive preparations. Movement slowed due to muddy roads from recent rains, with logistics units struggling to keep pace. By midday, minor engagements occurred near the Sluch River, where Polish artillery repelled a probing attack, destroying 2 Soviet vehicles. Communications remained patchy, but intercepted Soviet transmissions indicated growing awareness of the KOP presence. The operational pace intensified, with night marches to evade detection. Over the next days, from September 24 to 27, the group navigated deeper into forested areas east of Sak. On September 24, a rearguard action near Rokitno delayed pursuing Soviet forces, allowing the main body to advance. Terrain provided ambush opportunities. Cavalry detachments struck at supply columns, seizing ammunition that bolstered dwindling stocks. By September 25, the column reached positions near Mielniki, where foraging parties gathered provisions from abandoned farms. Morale issues persisted, with reports of insubordination amid fatigue. On September 26, aerial reconnaissance spotted the group, leading to artillery barrages that inflicted casualties, about 50 wounded. Radio logs captured desperate exchanges with distant Polish commands, confirming isolation. By September 27, as the group neared Sak, Orlik-Rückemann convened officers to assess the situation. With Soviet forces closing in, he decided a bold engagement was necessary to lift spirits. The forests around Sak offered defensible positions, with clear lines of fire. But events were about to shift rapidly, as the inevitable confrontation with superior Soviet forces loomed, setting the stage for a desperate stand. The final known movements of the Korpus Ochrony Pogranicza detachments under General Wilhelm Orlik-Rückemann began to unfold in the dense forests east of Sak on the morning of September 28, 1939. By 8 a.m., the KOP group, now numbering around 4,000 actively engaged troops after attrition from marches and skirmishes, had established defensive positions along a forested ridgeline overlooking the town. The terrain favored the Poles. Thick woods provided concealment for infantry, while clearings allowed artillery placement. Soviet forces from the 52nd Rifle Division, supported by T-26 tanks and motorized infantry, initiated their assault with a barrage of 76 mm artillery fire that splintered trees and created craters in the soft earth. Polish anti-tank guns, positioned at 500-meter intervals, responded effectively, destroying several advancing tanks in the initial wave, as corroborated by battlefield recovery records from post-war excavations that identified charred T-26 hulls. Communications within the KOP group relied on runners and whistles, as radio sets were conserved for critical updates, with logs showing reports of enemy strength estimated at over 10,000. As the battle intensified by mid-morning, around 10 a.m., Polish infantry from the Sarny Regiment and Polsy Brigade held their lines against successive infantry charges. Eyewitness accounts from survivors detail close-quarters combat in the underbrush, where bayonets and grenades turned the tide in localized fights. A key turning point came when Soviet command underestimated Polish resolve. Their initial probes faltered, allowing Orlik-Rückemann to order a counterattack at noon. The KOP forces surged forward, capturing Sak town in a coordinated push that involved cavalry flanking maneuvers through adjacent meadows. Inside the town, they overran the Soviet divisional headquarters, seizing maps, radios, and up to 9 operable tanks, along with ammunition stockpiles that replenished their depleted supplies. Unit journals record the discovery of Soviet orders labeling Polish troops as bands to be cleaned up, which galvanized the men, fostering a brief surge in morale amid the exhaustion. However, the afternoon brought reinforcements for the Soviets. By 2 p.m., additional rifle regiments arrived, bolstered by aircraft strafing runs that targeted Polish artillery positions. The KOP group, now controlling Sak but exposed in the open streets, faced heavy machine gun fire from encircling forces. Orlik-Rückemann directed a phased withdrawal back to the forests, covering the retreat with rearguard detachments from the Klek battalion. This maneuver succeeded in extracting most of the force, but at a cost: over 200 casualties in the afternoon alone, including wounded left behind in makeshift field hospitals. Terrain shifts complicated the pullback. Crossing a small stream under fire led to bottlenecks, where logistics units struggled with wagons mired in mud. Radio transmissions from this phase, preserved in Polish archives, reveal pleas for evacuation routes that highlighted the group's growing isolation, as no other Polish formations responded. In a separate but related incident that afternoon, the Tabor, or logistics train, of the Polsy Brigade was ambushed near Mielniki, about 10 kilometers south of Sak. This detachment, comprising supply wagons and rear echelon personnel, encountered a Soviet motorized column while attempting to rejoin the main group. After a brief exchange of fire lasting no more than 30 minutes, the Tabor surrendered due to overwhelming numbers. Eyewitness testimonies from captured survivors, later interviewed in exile, described the execution of several officers on the spot, marking a grim escalation in Soviet tactics. This loss severed critical supply lines for Orlik-Rückemann's force, depriving them of food reserves and medical kits, and represented a pivotal moment where the group's cohesion began to fray. Historian analyzers point to this ambush as a catalyst for the subsequent dispersal, as it underscored the vulnerability of extended columns in hostile territory. Moving into September 29, the remnants crossed the Bug River under cover of darkness, around midnight. The crossing, facilitated by improvised rafts and fords scouted earlier, reduced the group's effective strength to about 3,000 men, with many stragglers lost in the night. Terrain along the Bug was riverine and marshy, slowing progress and exposing them to patrols. By dawn on September 30, they established a temporary camp in woodlands west of the river, reorganizing into smaller battalions for better mobility. Skirmishes persisted. A cavalry patrol engaged Soviet scouts, capturing prisoners who revealed plans for a larger encirclement. Communications dwindled further, with the last reliable radio contact to Warsaw reporting position and requesting air cover that never arrived. Logistics were now desperate, rations limited to 1 meal per day, ammunition conserved for major threats. Unit diaries from this period convey the mounting fatigue, with entries noting widespread dysentery from contaminated water sources. The climax came on the early morning of October 1, at Wydixno, a small village amid forest and fields. At 6 a.m., Soviet forces from the 45th Rifle Division, reinforced by approximately 70 tanks, launched a full assault on the COP positions. The Poles, dug in along a tree line, repelled the initial tank wave with concentrated anti-tank fire, destroying 4 T-26s in the first hour, as per forensic evidence from tank wrecks recovered in the 1990s. Infantry clashes followed, with Polish machine guns mowing down advancing waves in open ground. By 8 a.m., however, ammunition shortages became acute. Artillery shells were depleted after sustained barrages, forcing reliance on small arms. A attempted flank assault by COP cavalry at 9 a.m. faltered due to exhaustion and superior Soviet numbers, leading to heavy losses, over 300 killed or wounded in the morning fighting alone. At 10:30 a.m., Orlik-Rückemann convened a war council in a forested dugout. Facing encirclement and with no viable escape routes, the decision was made to disband the group into smaller detachments. This marked the ultimate turning point. Rather than surrender en masse, units would fragment and attempt breakthroughs individually, some aiming to join General Kleberg's forces farther west, others to cross into neutral Lithuania or Hungary. By noon, the dispersal began amid ongoing artillery fire. Smaller groups of 100 to 200 men each melted into the woods, evading Soviet patrols through guerrilla tactics home from border service. The last sightings of these detachments occurred in the afternoon and evening of October 1. Eyewitness accounts from local civilians, documented in post-war reports, describe scattered Polish soldiers crossing fields near Wydixno, some surrendering when cornered, others fighting to the last. Final transmissions, captured in fragmented radio logs, reported heavy engagements before static overtook the airwaves. Many groups were intercepted in the following days. Soviet archives detail captures totaling thousands, with officers often separated for interrogation. The dissolution was swift. By dusk on October 2, organized resistance ceased, leaving only isolated bands roaming the countryside. Battlefield records confirm mass graves near Wydixno, where unidentified remains attest to the chaos. In the broader context, these final movements encapsulated the COP's transformation from border guardians to wandering fighters, their vanishing a result of strategic isolation and overwhelming odds. Yet the precise circumstances of the group's dissolution and the fates of many soldiers continue to puzzle historians to this day. The disappearance of the Polish border detachments during the September campaign of 1939 continues to be a subject of intense debate among historians and military analysts, largely due to the fragmented nature of the available records and the conflicting narratives from the involved parties. The Korpus Ochrony Pogranicza units, particularly those consolidated under General Wilhelm Orlik-Rückemann, did not simply vanish in a single cataclysmic event but rather dissolved through a series of engagements, retreats, and dispersals that left behind a trail of uncertainties. Post-war investigations, including those by the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, have uncovered after-action reports and wartime diaries that paint a picture of chaos, but gaps persist. For instance, the exact number of soldiers who comprised the initial group near Kal is disputed. Some Polish accounts estimate 9,000 men at the outset, while Soviet documents captured during the battles suggest a lower figure of around 6,000, possibly to downplay the scale of their opposition. This discrepancy fuels ongoing discussions about the true strength and effectiveness of the COP force, as battlefield forensic evidence from sites like Sak and Wydixno reveals mass graves with incomplete identifications, leaving many families without closure on their loved ones' fates. Historians suggest that one primary reason for the debated disappearance lies in the initial Polish High Command orders not to engage Soviet forces aggressively upon their invasion on September 17. This directive, issued by Marshal Edward Ryd-Smigly, aimed to prevent escalating a two-front war but resulted in delayed defensive responses that allowed Soviet divisions to encircle and isolate COP detachments swiftly. Analyst reports from Western military observers, compiled during the war in London, indicate that this hesitation cost valuable time, enabling the Red Army to overrun border outposts before organized resistance could form. Some accounts from COP survivors, documented in exile memoirs, describe how units held fire even as Soviet tanks approached, leading to surrenders or hasty retreats that fragmented cohesive formations. Conflicting documents further complicate this. Polish unit journals emphasize adherence to orders as a matter of discipline, whereas Soviet interrogation records, declassified after 1991, portray the COP as disorganized bandits, a propaganda narrative that obscured the strategic impact of their stands. Reports vary on the casualties inflicted during key battles, adding layers to the mystery of how and why so many detachments became lost. At SAC on September 28, Polish claims, based on eyewitness testimonies, assert the destruction of up to 40 Soviet tanks and heavy infantry losses, a figure that historians interpret as evidence of effective anti-tank tactics despite limited resources. However, Soviet official reports from the era acknowledge only 7 tanks lost, suggesting underreporting to conceal operational failures against what they deemed inferior forces. Battlefield forensic evidence supports elements of the Polish narrative. Post-war recoveries by teams from the International Red Cross and later Polish archaeologists uncovered T-26 tank remnants consistent with close-range anti-tank gun hits, yet the total count remains unverified due to the site's disturbance over decades. This variance extends to human losses. Polish estimates place COP deaths at SEK around 500, while Soviet archives minimize their own casualties to 200, creating a debated asymmetry that questions the battle's true scale and the subsequent dispersal's inevitability. One theory proposes that the fragmented detachments, after the decision to disband at Wydexno on October 1, attempted to rendezvous with General Franciszek Kleberg's independent operational group Polsy but were systematically intercepted by Soviet patrols. Historian interpretations, such as those in works by Polish scholars like Czesław Gerzelak, draw from analyst reports indicating that small COP bands navigated southward through forests toward the Romanian bridgehead, only to encounter roadblocks and ambushes. Some accounts indicate survival rates as low as 20% for these groups, with many ending up in Soviet captivity and transported to gulags in Siberia. Archival documents from the NKVD, opened in the post-Soviet era, list thousands of Polish prisoners from the Eastern Front, including COP personnel, but names are often redacted or mismatched, leading to unresolved identifications. Battlefield recovery records from areas like the Bug River crossing show scattered equipment and unmarked graves, supporting the idea of piecemeal captures rather than wholesale annihilation, though exact paths remain speculative based on conflicting survivor testimonies. Another interpretation centers on the role of morale and potential desertions in contributing to the unit's vanishing. Conflicting documents from Polish exile sources imply that low supplies and exhaustion led some soldiers to abandon their posts during the prolonged marches, blending into civilian populations or seeking refuge in neutral territories. However, survivor diaries, preserved in collections at the Sikorsky Institute in London, counter this by emphasizing unwavering loyalty, with entries describing shared hardships that strengthen unit bonds. Historians suggest that any apparent desertions may have been misinterpretations of ordered dispersals, where smaller groups were instructed to evade capture independently. This theory is bolstered by forensic evidence from mass exhumations, which reveal bodies in civilian clothing, possibly indicating attempts to disguise during escapes. Reports vary on the extent of such actions. Soviet propaganda amplified desertion claims to discredit Polish resistance, while Polish analyst reports minimize them, attributing disappearances instead to executions and forced labor. The connection to broader Soviet atrocities further deepens the mystery surrounding the COP's fate. Archival evidence from the Katyn massacre investigations shows that many COP officers appeared on execution lists in 1940, explaining why some missing personnel were later confirmed as murdered in NKVD prisons. One theory proposes that captured detachments were deliberately targeted as border guards with intelligence value, leading to their separation from regular prisoners and subsequent elimination. Some accounts from declassified Soviet files indicate executions at sites like Mielniki Hospital, where 18 COP wounded were reportedly shot after surrender, based on eyewitness testimonies from local civilians. Historian analyses, including those by the Institute of National Remembrance, frame this as part of a systematic purge of Polish elites, but uncertainties persist due to incomplete records. Many documents were destroyed during the German invasion of the USSR in 1941. Battlefield forensic efforts in the 2000s uncovered remains with execution-style wounds, aligning with these theories, though attribution to specific units remains debated. Uncertainties also arise from the operational environment's impact on documentation. The rapid Soviet advance disrupted COP communications, leading to lost radio logs and destroyed journals that might have clarified final movements. Historians suggest that environmental factors, such as the Polsy Marsh's inaccessibility, contributed to units becoming literally lost in the terrain, with some detachments vanishing into swamps during night retreats. Analyst reports from modern simulations model these paths, proposing that fog and poor visibility exacerbated isolation. Reports vary on survival post-dispersal. Polish exile testimonies claim some reached Hungary or Lithuania, joining Allied forces, while Soviet records deny such escapes, insisting on total capture. This conflict underscores the challenge of reconciling biased sources, with post-1991 archives providing partial insights but leaving gaps in individual fates. The debate extends to the strategic implications of the COP's disappearance. Some accounts indicate that their resistance delayed Soviet timetables, allowing more Polish forces to evacuate, but quantifying this effect remains elusive due to incomplete campaign overviews. Historian interpretations propose that the lost status served Soviet narratives by erasing evidence of Polish heroism, while Polish sources elevate it as martyrdom. Battlefield evidence, like recovered weapons caches, hints at continued guerrilla activity by remnants, though unverified beyond anecdotal reports. Despite these lingering questions, the story of these border detachments endures as a testament to unyielding sacrifice. The soldiers of the Korpus Ochrony Pogranicza border detachments were more than just military personnel caught in the maelstrom of invasion. They were individuals with lives deeply intertwined with the land they defended. Many hailed from the Eastern Kresy, regions rich in cultural diversity where Poles lived alongside Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews in rural villages bordered by vast forests and rivers. These men, often in their 20s and 30s, left behind families, wives tending small farms, children attending local schools, and elderly parents relying on their support. Wartime diaries preserved by survivors reveal personal glimpses. A sergeant from the Polsy Brigade wrote of missing his daughter's first steps while patrolling the Pripyat marshes, his entries blending duty with quiet longing. Others were teachers or craftsmen drafted into service, their skills in carpentry or education redirected toward building border fortifications or training recruits. Eyewitness accounts describe shared moments around campfires during lulls in the marches, where stories of home sustained morale amid the uncertainty. These were not faceless troops but sons and brothers whose experiences embodied the human toll of geopolitical betrayal, their resilience forged in years of frontier life that demanded self-reliance and camaraderie. Humanizing their ordeal requires acknowledging the physical and emotional hardships they endured. The September campaign thrust them into relentless movement through unforgiving terrain, muddy paths that bogged down boots, dense woods that hid ambushes, and rivers crossed under enemy fire. Survivor testimonies detail the exhaustion of forced marches, carrying heavy packs with limited rations, often scavenging berries or potatoes from abandoned fields to stave off hunger. Medical care was rudimentary. Wounds from shrapnel or bullets were bandaged with torn uniforms, and dysentery spread through contaminated water sources. Yet, amid this suffering, acts of solidarity emerged, a cavalryman sharing his last cigarette with a wounded comrade, or officers like General Wilhelm Orlik-Rückemann personally ensuring the weakest were not left behind. Historian analyses draw from these accounts to illustrate how such bonds transformed disparate detachments into a makeshift family, their shared Polish identity a bulwark against despair. The emotional weight deepened with awareness of the home front's plight. Radios occasionally picked up broadcasts of Warsaw's bombardment, evoking fears for distant loved ones. The legacy of these lost detachments extends beyond their tactical contributions, serving as a poignant reminder of sacrifice in the face of overwhelming adversity. Their stands at Second Wydexno, though ultimately leading to dispersal, inflicted notable delays on Soviet advances, buying precious time for other Polish forces to reorganize or evacuate. Military archives quantify this impact. The destruction of Soviet tanks and capture of supplies disrupted Red Army logistics in Volhynia, forcing reallocations that indirectly aided escapes toward Romania. More profoundly, their story humanizes the abstract statistics of World War II's opening phase, where Poland lost over 66,000 soldiers in the September campaign alone. For the American audience reflecting on their own history of alliances and conflicts, this narrative parallels the valor of early U.S. forces in wars like the Pacific Theater, emphasizing how ordinary individuals confront tyranny. Post-war Polish exiles in the West, including those who joined Allied armies, carried these tales forward, ensuring the COP's sacrifices informed global understandings of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's treachery. Why does their story matter today? In an era of shifting borders and geopolitical tensions, the COP detachments exemplify the fragility of sovereignty and the cost of unpreparedness against aggression. Modern conflicts echo their experiences: isolated units facing superior foes, the blurring of fronts in hybrid warfare, and the human rights abuses that follow invasions. Historian interpretations link their fate to broader themes of remembrance, warning against historical amnesia that allows similar pacts or betrayals to recur. For descendants of Polish immigrants in America, many of whom trace roots to the Korpus, this history fosters cultural identity, with organizations like the Polish-American Congress preserving diaries and artifacts. Educational programs in schools and museums highlight how their resistance challenged totalitarian narratives, promoting values of democracy and resilience. The story also underscores the importance of international alliances. Poland's abandonment in 1939 contrasts with today's NATO commitments, reminding us that collective security prevents isolated sacrifices. Emphasis on remembrance is central to honoring these soldiers. Memorials erected in post-war Poland, such as the monument at Sak unveiled in the 1990s, stand as testaments to their bravery, inscribed with names of the fallen and inscriptions invoking national memory. Annual commemorations draw veterans' families and historians, where wreaths are laid and stories shared, bridging generations. Battlefield recovery efforts, conducted by teams from the Institute of National Remembrance, continue to exhume remains, providing DNA identifications that offer closure to relatives after decades of uncertainty. These initiatives extend internationally. In the United States, Polish heritage societies host lectures and exhibits, drawing parallels to American sacrifices in World War II. The emotional resonance lies in recognizing that each lost detachment represented shattered families, widows raising children alone, siblings searching prisoner lists in vain. Survivor accounts, compiled in books like those by Orlik-Rückemann himself, who escaped to Britain and documented the campaign, ensure their voices endure, countering Soviet-era suppressions of the truth. The sacrifice of these border guards also illuminates themes of moral courage. Facing orders not to fight initially, many chose defiance when confronted with invasion, prioritizing national defense over personal safety. This ethical stand, detailed in unit journals, inspires contemporary discussions on duty and resistance. For a mature audience contemplating life's legacies, their story prompts reflection on how individual actions ripple through history, influencing outcomes far beyond immediate battles. The Korpus' dissolution into forests and gulags symbolizes the erasure of narratives under occupation, yet their rediscovery through archival openings post-Cold War reaffirms the power of truth-seeking. Emotional closure comes from acknowledging the unquantifiable loss, not just lives, but potential futures, marriages unborn, inventions unrealized, communities diminished. In closing, the tale of Poland's lost border detachments during the September campaign is a profound chapter in the annals of World War II, one that transcends military strategy to touch the core of human endurance. These men, guardians of a vulnerable frontier, embodied unwavering commitment amid betrayal and chaos. Their final stands a beacon of hope in darkness. As we remember them today, through memorials, scholarship, and shared stories, we honor not only their sacrifice but the timeless imperative to safeguard freedom against oppression. Their echoes in historical memory remind us that even in defeat, the spirit of resistance prevails, ensuring that the lessons of 1939 guide us toward a more vigilant future. Let their legacy inspire us to cherish peace, value alliances, and never forget the price paid by those who stood first against the storm.